Chris, I want to welcome you to Framing Leadership. So this is part of Framework Leadership, kind of leadership podcast. We try to invite leaders we love and we think are outstanding and kind of exemplify what leadership is. And you're definitely one of those people. So, I mean, you're probably one of the most authentic leaders I've ever met. I've had the pleasure to work with you for really the last few years. But, I think the one thing I wanted people to see with Chris Deluzio is how authentic you are. You have a group of people who will follow you anywhere. I mean, there is a group that would get on a van and we'd be your roadies, the Deluzio, BJ Jones roadies, to go to any company you guys set your 10 up at. And we'd help you do whatever that needed to make that company successful. I think that's kind of the interesting thing I've seen through working with you and BJ is just the roadies and the followers you built. People who love your leadership style, they're drawn to it, and you kind of exemplify an authentic leadership that I think is rare in the level that you're at. I mean, because you've led large organizations, mid-sized organizations, startup organizations. You have this philosophy that's really business and people first. I think people first is your first mindset. So I just want to ask you a question. How did you develop that mindset around authenticity? And when you hear people say, Chris Deluzio is a pretty authentic leader, what does that mean to you?
Well, first off, thank you. I think you're embellishing a bit, but I appreciate that about you, Todd. So thank you. Thanks to you and Rich for having me. For me, I think about this. I hear that a lot, is the authenticity, right? Yeah. And for me, what I learned early in pharma, as I'm sure you did, and while we were at two different organizations, I think they were relatively similar, where senior leaders at the level that like I was just at in the last organization I was at, they were untouchable and unapproachable. And I remember one leader in particular when I started in the industry. It was a large training class, 600 people. And I remember him in a full suit and tie, walking amongst the audience and literally puffing his chest out, putting his hands across his chest. And like, you even looked at him and you were like, you would cower to some extent. And I remember thinking, being very young at the time, that, if I ever get into a position of leadership, and at the time it was me thinking maybe being a district manager, that's not how I'm going to be. And, the authentic approach that I take is, I'm no different than you or anybody else that may be sitting in the audience or works in an organization that I'm in. I just happen to be at a different level doing a different job. You and I have talked about it, where I've said, I'm an idiot like the rest of us. You know what I mean? And I've just had some luck along the way and worked with some very good people that have allowed me to get in more of a senior level position. So first and foremost, the authenticity is, I'm no different than anybody else. Again, our background may be different. We may have been raised a little bit differently, but I'm just in a different position. So, I think the other piece that adds to it in terms of the authenticity is the humility.
Yeah.
And I've struggled with that, in that, again, calling myself an idiot. I always joke, a few years back, we all know Cafe Pharma. Someone had put on Cafe Pharma, and a buddy of mine brought it up to me, and he said, "Hey, there's this funny comment about you where it said, listen, if you want to do well with Chris Deluzio, just take him to every restaurant you possibly can, because he's fat and he likes to eat." And I'm like, that's true. I do like to eat. But, my point is the humility is good. And I recognize there's, I have a ton of proverbial warts. As a leader, I think showing some of that humility and being true to it, meaning it can't be manufactured, is important, but not too much humility. Where you show too much humility, then people may believe it and think, wow, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. Right. So it's, again, I'm like, you guys,
it's disingenuous, because you have a lot of strengths. And if you're so self-deprecating and so humble, people are starting like, is this guy, he doesn't understand his strength, or he's just kind of played to the crowd a little bit. And, I think to your point, I think there's a difference between being humble, which brings people in and helps people be part of the process of making that company better, which I think you do really well. And then there's a thing of being so self-deprecating that people are like, it's painful. He's too sweet. I'm getting a toothache because I don't know. You know what I mean?
Yes. Or I can take advantage of that. And I don't want anyone ever think that. And I think a good balance, the example I try to give, and you live this with me, is, something like call planning, to stand up in front of a group and say that I know everything and here's what you should do every day from a call planning standpoint is unrealistic.
Right.
Be able to say, I don't know it, guys. You know the local level. I don't know every territory in this country. I need your input, please. And then we'll bring it together and I'll do what you need me to do. And that's lead how we get through that. So, I think with that humility, again, to your point, being humble, you have to find the balance. And with that, the balance to that humility is setting expectations.
Yep.
That authenticity and humility helps me build relationships. And I think what you and others would agree with is to say, in any family or any organization where you build those relationships, it can't be all good all the time.
Yeah.
And with that comes expectations, right? We preached all the time at Biohaven, we are a family.
Yeah.
Well, you know what, TB, right? If you're not performing as a family member, I'm going to hold you accountable.
Yeah.
And we're going to figure out what we're going to do. The difference for me is the family aspect of saying, we're going to work together to figure it out, but doesn't mean you're not going to be held accountable. So
right.
I think the authenticity and the humility allows you to build relationships and then create that family atmosphere where people want to win together. It's, your comment about people want to do anything for me. I think they want to do anything for us because
right.
we've built this incredible team. And with that comes setting expectations, accountability, and things like that. The last thing I will say, and you and I have had many discussions around this, is you truly have to listen and care. And the end care piece is what matters to me, meaning we just talked about it, right? Hayden and Haley, right? I have 3 kids. You know what my kids' interests are. I think almost in any leadership book early on, when you grew up in the industry, as a leader, you have to ask somebody, so tell me about yourself and tell me about your family.
Yeah.
You leave that conversation and they remember nothing.
Right.
The authenticity of being a good leader who truly listens and cares for me is to be able to say, hey, Todd, how are Hayden and Haley? That type of thing versus, somebody said to me recently, how are your 2 kids doing? I'm like, 2 of them are good, but I have a 3rd as well. So my point is truly listening and caring, in my opinion, has helped me create a following that I think we could go anywhere together and achieve success.
Yeah, no doubt. I think that it is fun. That picture, the story about the stoic leader who walks in, and I've always felt like those type of people were looking for me doing something wrong so they could tell me I was doing something wrong instead of saying, hey, Todd, this is what you do well. This is where I think you can go. It's always, they felt like you walked around and you're like on pins and needles because and then I think that stifles, to your point, innovation, creativity, the ability to collaborate and do and work on business problems together and solve them together, which I think inhibits a company to reach their optimal performance levels.
Yeah. And I think, again, I mean, we've all read our leadership books, and I remember people saying to me, you want to hire your next boss. And with that, whether they're your next boss or not, you bring people with incredible talent, and you've got to have, back to humility, you've got to have the confidence and humility to understand that, again, you don't know it all. Let's work as a team to figure it out. And when you give that ownership to people, what you can create as a family and a team is like nothing I've ever seen. And I shouldn't say that. It's like what we created at Biohaven.
Yeah, I know that. So love that. I mean, I think that's why as I said before, why people follow you. There's a roadie group that would get on a bus and go wherever you go because of that authenticity, that ability to collaborate and bring people together. There's true psychological safety where we work together. I mean, you always ask people, BJ always asks people like, what's working? Where are we getting stuck? What the hell do we need to do different? You told really good stories as well. So I think as a leader, you told really good stories, which I also thought was something that brought people into the standards and expectations that you had for them. How important is storytelling to you as a leader, especially from a leader who led large sales organizations, who led large operations units within large organizations? Is storytelling something that came to you, or is it something that you figured out over time that it's important to be able to tell stories to connect with people?
It's a great question. And I believe that it's a forgotten or ignored art at times. For me, again, going back to family, it was always one of those things that my father took much pride in. My brother, great storyteller, embellishes a bit. You've got to kind of try to figure out that balance of what's true and what's not. For me as a leader, and I know we'll kind of talk about management, leadership, and coaching. as a leader, for me, leadership is about, how you convey yourself and things in a broad setting or to a group. And again, that could be 10 people, it could be 1,000 people. And
Right.
storytelling is so key, in my opinion, to it's the proverbial sort of acting hook, right? If you start a story with something that breaks down walls, right? I think, you've read sort of similar things that using the right profanity,
Yeah.
you know,
You have that art perfected.
can, can break down walls. And people say,
Yeah.
again, back to the authenticity. Wow, this guy is real. This guy is human. But it allows you to set the stage and tell a story, because to just show data, it doesn't tell a story. You tell that story with data. It pulls people in, and it allows you see an engagement, and the nonverbals that can kind of lead you to believe people are buying in, meaning
Yeah.
like head nodding, it could be eye rolling, or raising of the eyebrows, whatever it is.
I've seen
Being
hand slapping when people see you present and they hear, a profanity word there. After a while, they expected it. And when they heard it, you heard high fives and you're like, "Oh, Chris is getting real. He's talking to the people."
well, and it's the right profanity. I want to
Yeah.
be clear,
Yeah. No doubt.
but
Yeah. No, it's
but
like I said, it's artfully and skillfully done.
well, you know it, right? And I've seen you do it. We talk about music, right? The passion. You've
Oh,
got
yeah.
to have the passion. If you're truly passionate and you believe it, people are going to see that. And
Yeah.
then to wrap a story around it, it can't be blah, 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 blah. Stop, right? Let me
Yeah.
read my teleprompter. It's all right. Let's talk about this, right? Let's talk about the success story that came with this. And also, let's talk about the failures and the learnings. Like I've said a million times, like the failures that I've had over the years have truly helped me learn so much. Now, let me tell you a story about that, right?
Right.
Where some of the self-deprecation comes into play. It's just, in my opinion, just such a better way to bring people in and enjoy the story together
Yeah.
versus putting a bunch of numbers up on a slide, or just reading a script.
Yeah.
Hopefully that makes sense.
Oh, no, totally. So you talked a little bit about this concept of manager, leader, coach, right? And we've all played those roles. One of the things I've seen in my life as being a leader is you've had people who are really good managers, but they're not really strong leaders or coaches. I really believe that as artificial intelligence comes into our world and continues to permeate both personal and professional life, that for a manager, AI is going to do a much better job of managing all the things a manager needs to do. Looking at numbers, reports, managing expense reports, those things are important. You have to manage process and lead people. But there's nobody who's really just a good manager and not a good leader, coach who's going to involve people and drive performance. When you think about those three concepts, first of all, how much time does somebody spend in the role as manager, leader, and coach? I'm going to start there. What do you think about manager, leader, and coach, and how much time should somebody spend in those roles?
So I think you framed it up well, right? From a management standpoint, manager to me, and this is how I started in the industry, 26 years ago, is that it was all about process. You said it. So manager for me is the day-to-day now, as I see it, are the day-to-day requirements of doing the job. You said it,
Right.
expense report. So as your manager, I'm going to make sure we get our expense reports in on time. I'm going to make sure we stick with budget. I'm going to make sure we're compliant, those types of things. And years ago, that was enough to get by with big multi-blockbuster brands in a portfolio. I mean, I tell people when I started, I had the pleasure of selling Plavix, Pravachol, and Glucophage all in the same bag. I think at the time they were $14 billion combined.
Right.
That was easy. All
Yeah.
I had to do was to go home and do my expense report. But that's not where we should be today. And we should not have just managers. I'll get to the percentages of what that looks like moving forward. Leadership, I talk a lot about, the leader aspect of, for me, that is, and some people would disagree, I'm sure, is, what? I have a team call every Friday. That's how I represent myself and the expectations I set amongst the team, meaning accountability is consistent across all 10 people. Here are the strategic initiatives I have from my boss and from the organization. Guys, let's talk about it. Let's talk about this strategy of selling one product for 2 indications and 1 NDC. How do we do that? Let's talk about it. Towing the company line to some extent, but also allowing the freedom to push back, right?
Yeah.
How do you represent yourself in front of a group? And is there consistency there with the broader organization? Because as a leader, I've got to align with the top and
Yep.
then execute against it with those that work with me and for me. Coaching is so sorely missed.
Yeah.
And coaching to me, and again, some may disagree, is the one-on-one. It's the conversations we have to say, hey, TB, we just had this great leadership call. Tell me about what you think. Tell me
Yeah.
what you think about the strategy. All right, how are you going to execute it? All right, well, listen, again, back to the accountability piece. I
Yeah.
agree. That to some extent, this bullet point kind of deviates
Yeah.
from the strategy. Tell me why. All right, great. How are we going to execute that? But maybe tailor it a little bit. To me, that coaching is one-on-one, and it's an ability to sort of transfer knowledge and then that coaching becoming self-coaching, meaning you got 10 reps. I can't be with 10 reps all the
Right.
time. So that one-on-one coaching is so important. Now, when I leave that rep, do they coach themselves through the day-to-day of being in front of customers? So in my opinion, the most successful leaders can bring all of those three components, which I think you and Rich have defined so well, together and finding the right balance. And I
Yeah.
think how you find that right balance starts with the expectations of the leader above you. My perspective would be 80% should be devoted to coaching, right? Meaning leadership is incredibly important. But if you're on conference calls all the time, your reps aren't out doing what they should be doing. Management, if you set the appropriate expectations around expense reports, compliance, things like that, it should be sort of self-guided,
Yeah.
which allows much more time to coach. And that is so critical to anyone's success that I think that is kind of how I see the balance of where coaching fits from a percentage standpoint. And what's in coaching is a much more detailed discussion,
Yeah.
meaning business acumen, clinical sell, those types of things. But that's a big bucket, and I think that's where the majority of time should be spent.
Yeah. Well, you see some of the data, because I know you talked about this on a call with a company called PBG, where they showed data that only on a percentage wise, leaders are only spending 9% of their time coaching. I mean, now you said 80%, so we're about 71% short right now of that. So I definitely agree with you there. I think the one thing I always felt about coaching was there's two things, and I looked at research of a ton of different coaches. I think you hit on two different ways of coaching. I always felt like if you look at Pat Summit, or you look at John Wooden, or you look at the best coaches, they set a team expectation. Kind of your team call on Friday is that team leadership. I'm setting expectations. We're discussing strategy and tactics to overcome the issues that we're facing or the way we capitalize on this game or in this marketplace. And then there's that individual one-on-one coaching where I'm looking at somebody, I'm saying, what are the skills they need to do well to execute and optimize our plan? And that's why I think most coaches, they're okay at the leadership part, the big team call where they can set expectation. It's the one-on-one coaching where they think their job is to observe and assess somebody doing that job instead of, to your point, let's figure out what good looks like together. Let's really practice what good looks like. And I think so few coaches, they don't practice with people. They feel like, hey, I hired really people. They're good at their job. I'm not going to practice. Well, LeBron James practices. He's practiced the same damn drill since he was 6 years old. But it's funny how he can practice 2 to 3 hours a day, yet our salespeople and managers don't feel like they need to practice at all. They can just kind of wing it and go in and look at data and go, okay, I'm going to talk to Dr. Deluzio about this, or whatever role you're in and whatever organization or marketplace you're in. Practice with the mindset that needs to happen from a coaching standpoint because it establishes what good looks like. And so when I'm not with them, we both co-create a standard of what good looks like. So I don't have to, you can self-coach yourself now. If we both agree what good looks like, what a good sales process looks like, what a great story tells like, sound like, and it's easier for them to walk away and reach that standard and me continue to coach to elevate them in different areas. But I think to your point, people just don't coach because I think they feel like there's this halo effect of I hired good people. I'm here to assess and observe and ask Chris how this call went instead of saying, I don't want to ever ask you how the call went. I want to know how that call's going to go before, so we have a standard of what it looks like. So when I leave you, you can self-coach yourself. Does that make sense?
It does, but and there's a couple things there, right? To your point, well, I've hired great people. Well, you have, but you can also learn from them as a
Yeah.
good coach to take that to other people. Or to your point, they're self-coaching. You see some incredible things. Why not share best
Right.
practices, right? And allow them to help coach across the broader team. So there's that piece. And I think to your point, for me, it goes back to, like I said, the accountability and setting expectations. In a lot of cases, and what I've seen, and you and I have lived this in the biggest pharma organization to a very small one,
Yeah.
it starts at the top and what the expectations are there. Um, I will give a real world example of my last organization where we knew the data, and you saw the data, that we needed to do some things with our coaches to improve our performance
Yeah.
generally as an organization. And I don't think people bought into it. And I think a lot of it was my fault in terms of how I didn't set the appropriate
Yeah.
expectations. And then when we did, it was like, okay, great, Chris, I hear you, but what data do we have to support it? When you're able to show people data around
Yeah.
the impact that coaching can have, it will take that number, like you said, 9%, it'll take it dramatically higher, which is a good thing. So I think you have to add some data. The other piece to it, again, taking expectations not out of it, but is the coach of the coach.
Yeah.
I assumed, I fell into the trap that you just said. I said, well, I've got these second line leaders who are the best in the industry, and they are.
Yeah.
And with that, my assumption was they know what they're doing from coaching they know how to coach the coach. Absolutely, they do. In fact, they told me they did.
Yeah.
And in most cases, they did, but there was some refinement that needed to be done to say, all right, guys, you may think you got it, but let's get back into how we coach the coach. We've got the other things figured out, or we're figuring them out. Let's go back into looking at how our first line leaders are coaching their reps, and let's coach them on how to do it so they can then self-coach. And then for me, as that third line leader, how do I coach the coaches of the coaches?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's got to be a consistent expectation across the organization, and it can't be a one and done. It's got to be, how do we get into it, and how do we figure out to keep this alive? And that all comes down to the expectations and eliminating barriers. One of the biggest traps, in my opinion, organizations fall into is, hey, I need you on a conference call. Hey, I need you to do a business plan. Hey, I need you to do some training.
Yeah.
All right, well, to your point, that takes that coaching number or percentage down every day, and then you get it 9%. So what can you do to eliminate those barriers so people can actually go out and coach?
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I think that setting expectation, I do think that there's a disconnect between, we were both RDs together, and you've been an RD, then you've been at this third level of leadership, that where you have to coach people who are coaches, other coaches, which is a different level. And I think sometimes when we get to that RD level, people feel like, and I think RDs get pulled in tons of different directions. They're on marketing calls, right? They're on calls with, MSLs or other people, account managers. And I think they sometimes forget that their job is a talent developer, because they feel themselves as a business. They're business leaders, but business is driven by the people, and people drive business when they're better prepared to do that. So I think just shifting that mindset to, you're a talent developer. As an RD, your job is to not only drive our business, but you drive business through people, and people have to be prepared to drive business. And that's where I think, to your point, is how do we make sure that they understand that coaching is as important as a KPI? And it should be probably the most important KPI.
I would agree. And you know this in terms of how I laid out my strategic imperatives. It was always that winning because of our people. Yeah, we've got great budget. Yeah, we've got great product, but it comes down to the people, and back to what we spoke about earlier, people wanting to win and win for the organization. So I totally agree with you. Talent developer, people developers, it should be the key component to being a leader.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things you talked about too was this communicating and clarity. I always go back to Patrick Lencioni. I think his book is somewhere around my library. He wrote the book, The Advantage, which basically talks about smart and healthy organization. He says that there's a lot of companies that are smart. They're great in marketing. They have really good data. He said, but that's kind of the baseline. Every company is smart. They have great data and really good marketing people. the advantages when companies are healthier, right? They understand, to your point, what's our purpose? They can over communicate that clarity. I always go back to think about what you and BJ did at Biohaven, right? You launched in the midst of a pandemic, right? Not, I can tell you what a company I was at, we were out of the field. You guys were kind of finding ways to embrace going into the fray from a pandemic standpoint. How do you how did you and BJ look at that from a communication and clarity standpoint? And then how did you be so successful? You were David versus Goliath. I mean, you guys were small compared to a pretty big competitor. That you guys dominated that market to the point where you had a big company go like, "Nice job, I want."
Well, I think there's a couple things, right? I don't know how many people can say that they launched literally 2 days after a national lockdown, right?
Right,
And we take a lot of pride in that. I think we would have been successful anyway.
right,
But to your point, back to the leadership aspect, I think we being BJ, who, by the way, I I call him, he's the culture king. I mean,
yeah,
and what he's always done is given me the freedom to be who I am
yeah,
because of our personal relationship, that I can create these relationships. But I think we had a really strong following going into Biohaven prior to launch. I think what took us to the next level is recognizing that none of us had ever dealt with a global pandemic before. And when your stock drops, don't quote me, I think it was $28 in a day,
yeah,
and you're in a startup company, you got to keep it real. And
yeah,
that first call, when I had to tell everybody we were pulling out of the field because of the situation, which no one would disagree with.
yeah,
Well, most would not disagree with. It's you've got to be real, and it's like, guys, yes, the data would show, the stock would show that we don't know if we're going to make it. But here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to do it. And no, we don't have all the answers. So as we committed to you when we built this organization, we're going to come to you, and we need your input around how we're going to make this successful. To the point, and it may have been too much, but we were on the call. We were on a national call every day those first 2 weeks,
yeah,
just updating people on the progress that we've made and getting input. And then it became a matter of setting expectations, right? Because you had people who said, I'm cool being a virtual rep all the time. And I'm like, it's not what we signed up for. So here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to do it. Here's how we're going to protect you. But the expectation hasn't changed. Excuse me. We still need to be successful as an organization. So over communication was the most important thing that we could have done. And I think that's really what kind of brought people along with us. Some got to a point as we progressed through COVID and just said, I'm good,
yeah,
let me be. And it was let me be so I can go do something else. Or Chris, I'm good. Like I'm out. I got this figured out, and the numbers support it. So, I think the communication was so critical. And I think for me as the leader of the sales organization, back to BJ, him giving me the freedom of saying, Chris, nothing's off limits, right? Be you.
yeah,
And any example I give, as corny as it may be, like everybody was going through different things. And
right,
unfortunately, we lost people, we lost family, we lost friends.
yeah,
Where I remember just saying, would it help if I just put a video together of like what it's like in the Deluzio household right now,
hmm,
which is very, very challenging. At the time, 3 kids,
yeah,
well, still have 3 kids, but 3 kids, me, my wife,
yeah,
and my mother-in-law. So
yeah,
I remember putting a video together, just showing people like, I get it. Some of you may have lost people. Some of you may have lost friends. I haven't, fortunately, at the time, at least I hadn't, but I'm going through this with you guys, and look at what I'm dealing with, so just know we're all in it
right.
together. And I think that really helped.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt. I mean, I think that was a really cool step that you did, showing people your family. Again, people can relate pretty quickly with that. But it also galvanizes people together. Like, well, to your point, we're all in this together. I remember coming to Biohaven and be Biohaven. And even when we were transitioning and people were kind of questioning the transition into another company and potentially losing the things that made Biohaven so great, that you and the leaders consistently came back and said, let's leave a legacy. Let's be Biohaven until the day this deal closes. let's be Biohaven and let's show people that what we started with about helping these patients who are suffering with migraines every day. So the empathy that you showed during COVID, then the empathy that you showed to these patients with migraine and suffering migraine, there was a very unique culture around taking care of people, taking care of these patients, taking care of each other. That, I mean, that's what I said. I was drawn to that culture. I was drawn to the entrepreneurial spirit of that company, but I was also drawn to the culture that you guys built together. So I think the way you kind of told that story kind of galvanizes what people feel about your leadership, BJ's leadership, the authenticity you guys both brought to the table, and why I wanted so passionately to have you on Framing Leadership. And I appreciate you being here, man.
Listen, you exemplify this stuff every day, and that's why we ended up, joining forces again, because of how you do it, the passion you put behind it, and doing it the right way. And it was my pleasure to be here because, all the things I talked about, I learned over the years. I learned a lot from you over this last year or so, and prior to when we were peers. So my pleasure, TB. You let me know whatever you need, whenever you need it, and I'm in.
You're a good man, Chris. Well, we do have BJ as well coming in on Framing Leadership. So it's a Biohaven Love Fest with two of my favorite leaders, Chris Deluzio, BJ Jones, and Chris. Thanks for everything, man. Have a good rest of the summer. I hope we can connect and continue to work together. I definitely love learning from you and love your style. So thanks for everything. Have a great rest of your day.
My pleasure.
All right, brother.